are seeing all the unprecedented growth that we're seeing in data centers. Now, we know that we're in the midst of an energy transition. And so maybe I'll get straight into it, Mark. Data centers, I mean, we really are seeing unprecedented growth. And if I even look at the last 5 years, the number of data centers that are connecting to the grid, and also when I look at the pipeline of data center developments globally, it's quite, there's almost a quiet revolution happening, which is not so quiet anymore in parts of the world. If I was to quote some data where, just a few reports. So the global demand from data centers, we're expecting to increase 165% by 2030 compared to where we were in 2023. A Goldman Sachs research report recently showed that the global power demand from these data centers will increase by 50% by 2027. So just to kick off the discussion, can you talk me through what is driving this phenomenon or this growth in data centers? Why such numbers?
Why such numbers? Well, I mean, all the presentations today, certainly around mine, data centers, AI. So an underlying discussion is AI. And it's not really AI in isolation. It's the high performance compute that AI requires. So the astronomical growth is twofold. One, the amount of power that the high performance compute requires, but it's the sheer exponential growth that's driving that. So if we look today, most industries, most people are using AI in some form. But if everyone pulled out their phone and said, hey, Kay, is there an AI app running on that phone? Probably not directly on the phone, but certainly the data center supporting that. So the use cases, as quick as we can talk, is driving more and more demand around that. From an Australia-New Zealand perspective, Australia, in a lot of ways, punches well above its weight. We're number 8 in the world in terms of data centers, which when you think of our population, it's quite impressive. And behind that, we are a tier 1 country for the deployment of AI chips. So what I mean by that is NVIDIA, in principle, as an example, is limited in where it can send its chips. And in our zone, so that's the Asia Pacific region, it's Australia, Japan, South Korea. I think Taiwan's the other one. But if you look at our region and said, hang on, they're the only 3 countries that can have that platform, that's also driving the growth here in Australia and New Zealand. And New Zealand is the other country on that list as well.
Has there been a shift in the type of data centers that are being developed? So again, if we look over the last decade or so where we've suddenly seen this growth come through, is there a different model of data centers that is being deployed, which is driving this growth?
Not so much in the last couple of years. The last couple of years is sheer volume. If I look at where we are today, certainly by the end of this calendar year, we will see at least 2, if not 3, large-scale data centers in Australia that actually are what we call an AI data center. So when I say AI data center, they've got technology to support AI or high-performance compute. So that's liquid-cooled data centers. So those data centers, you're talking, 6 and 10 megawatt halls. That are actually using liquid cooling to cool them. So certainly up until now, no, it's just been a volume. But from here on in, we're going to see a large shift towards what we call liquid-cooled data centers. And those liquid-cooled data centers are talking 100 kilowatts, 200, and they're even talking 300, 400, even a megawatt per rack. So if you take this room, for example, and you can fit roughly, give or take, 20 racks in here, if you think those 20 racks were a megawatt each, I mean, you can see that there's 20 megawatts sitting in this room. So it's significant. And one little analogy, there's a 500 megawatt data center that's in the public domain that uses more power than all of Canberra. So it gives you a bit of an idea of the growth that data centers, one, in physical, the amount of data centers, but also the amount of power consumption that's required to support them. They're very energy efficient, but they do consume lots of power.
And that's exactly the point that I wanted to come to. I think when we look at the fact that even all of today, we're talking about reaching our sustainability goals, reaching our decarbonization goals through digitalization of our networks, through digitalization of our systems. Plus, in our personal lives, there's no end to the data that we're storing and that we're driving. So really, is it fair to say that the demand for data centers, as you see it, or the demand for managing, storing, computing our data is not slowing down, is not about to slow down?
You see lots of discussions in the media about what's happening with data centers, but everything that we can see now, you'll always have ebbs and flows. I mean, Australia traditionally in data center space has been very much a build year, buy year, build year, buy year. The last 3 years has very much been a buy and build, buy and build. And the growth has been quite significant. If we look out to 2030 and beyond, everything tells us that we will still continue to see quite rapid growth in the data center space. So storage, yes, that's always going to continue. So for every photo you take, it's stored probably 20 or 30 different locations, depending what it is. I've got it on, if I just look at myself personally, I take a photo and it's here, it's on my iPad, it's on my PC, it's on 4 or 5 different locations. Now it's on 4 or 5 different locations here, where's that being stored as well, let alone what's physically on those devices. So storage is another aspect of what's happening in the world of data centers.
No, absolutely. Now, the reason I am really interested in understanding more around the data center space, selfishly, really, coming from the power and grid world, is because of the power-hungry nature of the data centers. Now, whether we're talking about more advanced computing requirements that are coming through, whether we talk about the fact that there is an increased need to crunch more data, do more sophisticated analysis, but also just the pure fact that data centers require a specific temperature to operate in. So the cooling requirements that are quite power intensive, and now AI data centers being quite energy intensive, all of that drives quite a significant power demand on the grid. I was reading a stat recently that one average data center can consume about the same amount of energy required to power something like 50,000 homes, right? Average numbers that I'm throwing. And so one of the things that we would have seen that is happening globally is now grids globally struggling to meet or match the demand for data centers. Now, the data center developers, driven by our need to manage, store, compute data, and our push towards digitalization to meet all of our different ambition needs, that growth is not being supported by the energy capacity that is available in the grid. Can you talk me through what, if you're experiencing the same, and if you're across what's happening globally in this space?
I think globally it's very clear. I mean, excluding government regulations about data centers, but government regulations around data centers and their consumption of power is traditionally linked to availability of power. So if you've got unlimited power available, then there's no issue about having data centers. And ultimately, data centers drive AI, drive technology. So you could argue very easily that data centers are actually a really, really good thing because they drive investment, they drive efficiency. But from a global perspective, the governments have put mandates in some countries, like Singapore, for example. The UK had them, Germany had them. There's a number around the world that have put mandates about what you can and can't do. So what that then means is, where does the power come from? So the discussion is not whether a data center is a good thing or a bad thing. It's, is the power available? And it does, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, what can a data center be? Does it have to be an energy consumer? Can it be integrated with the grid? Can it be a power generator? And we'll talk more about that. But that's to answer your question. From an Australia perspective, we can all see that governments are driving coal-fired power stations to shut down. There's a big push for renewable energy. Most data centers in Australia today, or certainly the large ones, are using 100% renewables. Basically, they're either purchasing them, or in most cases, they're actually investing in renewables to support the data centers. Whether that's 24/7 renewable, that's another discussion, but certainly they are doing that. Now, the one argument is, okay, the data center's taking 100 megawatts of renewables, and that 100 megawatts is not being used in the grid, but net, it's not impacting the grid if that 100 megawatts is being built and designed to support the actual data center. So that's another interesting aspect of data centers that, they do invest in power generation, whether that's renewables or not. It's still generating power.
And so would it be fair to say, or I guess your thoughts, Mark, on the fact that do you find that, so we're clearly seeing examples in the US, for instance, where there is a specific constraint on grid capacity to be able to meet the data center growth. So I guess the growth in data centers is being constrained by the fact that the grid's not able to provide appropriate grid connection. And we're seeing that play out in parts of Europe as well. Has that story come through to Australia? Are you finding that a big enough conversation here yet?
Not in the open forum. So behind inverted commas, behind closed doors, there's certainly discussions going on with the energy providers about where are these data centers being built, where are they located, how do we connect to the grid. Two pieces are, there's the availability of power. So if I take a particular data center that's in the marketplace today, and I mentioned before, say 500 megawatts, yes, we've got to be able to generate that 500 megawatts, but where does it get located? Is it next to 330 kV power lines? Is it next to 550s? There's only limited spaces, if you look certainly on the eastern seaboard, where you can put that capacitive data center with the available infrastructure, because no one wants 330 kV power lines across their backyard. So you're not just going to overnight go and build that sort of infrastructure. It has a huge cost. The other really interesting thing is use it or lose it. That's a discussion that's being had. So the networks, and when I say the networks, I'm talking about the utility networks here, or the distribution network, is if I'm going to deploy 500 megawatts, as a provider of that energy, I have to build infrastructure to support it. So day one, I've only used 100 megawatts and I don't use the other 400. What do I do as an energy provider? Well, one simple thing is, if you don't use it, I'm still going to charge you for it. That discussion is definitely starting to happen. So that's a really interesting one, because I'm not going to invest that sort of money to build my grid, support it, and you don't use it. So that's definitely been had. Access to that power, there's a land grab. So fundamentally, the data center space is a real estate game. Real estate, there's land and power. If I can get the two, puts me in a good position. So I can have lots of land in Australia, but if I don't have any power to connect to it, it's not much good to me in a data center space. Unless I start to generate on site. That's another topic we're going to discuss too.
Oh, absolutely. I suppose from the grid side, in terms of our discussions with our grid customers, and I know we'll have some DNSPs in the room here today, but from the grid side, particularly in urban centres around Sydney and Melbourne, what we're finding is DNSPs really struggling to understand what their role as the network operator needs to look like in providing those grid connections to the growth that they're seeing in data centers. Particularly, we've got utilities in New South Wales or based in Sydney really grappling with that challenge. This is why I think it's quite an interesting conversation, because I'm wondering whether some of the dynamics that are playing out in the US and Europe already, is that soon to follow through in Australia, in the fact that if networks aren't able to provide sufficient grid capacity or grid connection, does that drive data center developers to look at other options? And for instance, you've already mentioned self-generation and be an element of being able to be self-sufficient. Is that you seeing that play out in the Pacific?
I haven't physically seen it as yet, but without question, if I look at a data center operator, and whether it's 100 megawatts, 2, 3, 4, 500, doesn't matter, the numbers are quite significant. If you look at the contracts that these organisations are signing, so you'll see someone say, like Goodman, for example, public domain, $4 billion investment to go after data centres, CDC, $1.5 billion to build their new campus. If you look at the amount of money that's invested in these data centres, it's a very simplistic answer, Ankanksha, but if I can't get power, what will I do? If I have to generate it, I will. I will do something to support those investments because, and I say this about our governments, at the end of the day, no data center global operator has to build here. So if our governments think that, your Microsofts, your Amazons, your Googles, your Facebooks, your Metas, you name it, have to build in Australia, they don't have to. Now, yes, there's the chip thing I spoke about before, but there are other places around the world. So an interesting point is, if you get government support to help our utilities, our generation companies invest in supporting the grid, then, hey, data centers are a great thing. If I look at Singapore, they can't build any more data centers because they've got no power and other reasons. Now, is that stymieing their economy? Not necessarily, but one could argue at some point it will. If we could capture that, And Australia being, geopolitical, very safe. We don't have too many natural disasters, really, ignoring cyclones that come down this far. But take Sydney, for example. Hasn't been too many natural disasters. You can build data centres in no fire zones, no flood zones. So, it's a very safe country to put it. It's actually very cheap to build data centres in Australia. And people might say, why is it cheap? You think expensive land, expensive labour. Because we build them fast and we build them on time. So I'll give you an example of that. If you build a 100 megawatt data centre and I need it running by the 1st of January next year, think of the cost if that data centre is not running by the 1st of January. $1 billion investment that isn't running because it's 6 months, 12 months late. There's $1 billion worth of IT kit sitting somewhere in the world that hasn't been deployed. I haven't supplied my contracts, etc. So Australia is a great country to actually deploy data centres, but if we don't have power and we don't have the grid and we don't have the things to support it, it has an impact.
Now, I know we're going to come to the really interesting point that I want to flesh out a little bit more, but I know we've talked in the past about data center developers looking at other generation options to serve their power needs. And one particular topic that we've spoken about is nuclear. And amongst all of the renewable sources of power that they can leverage to be able to be self-sufficient to a certain degree and enable that grid connection, do you find that access to the right grid capacity can or is leading data center developers to consider other technology?
Certainly from a global perspective, yes. If you have a look in the US, the amount of companies that are either building data centers next to nuclear power plants, potentially procuring small modular reactors is significant. Why is that? It's the significant amount of power and availability of power. So if I look today in Australia, and depending on which government's in power, and we won't get into politics, but obviously the discussion around nuclear is in the marketplace today. It's politically there. And at some point in time, Australia and New Zealand will make decisions on whether we have nuclear or not. And it's not for Aki, you or I to decide on that. I have my personal opinions on that, and I won't necessarily share them here. You might work them out, but I won't share that here. But it's about the discussion. For me, it's about if we're going to have large data centers, is nuclear an option? I mean, yes, it's an option. Whether we have it or not, it's another discussion. But it also talks about the beauty of nuclear from a data center perspective. If you look at small modular reactors, whether they're 300 megawatts or 500, people are talking about a data center campus. So if that data center campus was using nuclear power, is that nuclear power just used by the data center? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but it doesn't impact the grid. So it's an interesting topic. And then that becomes about power generation on site, whether that's gas turbines on site. There's an example in the US that I'm aware of that one data center was going to do something like 300 or 400 megawatts of gas turbines on site. However, the utilities went, hang on a minute, that's cutting our lunch, so to speak. So they said, hang on a minute, we'll do that, we'll develop that, we'll guarantee that if there's a blackout or something, you get availability of power. So interestingly enough, the utility said, well, we still want to do the generation. It's just we will actually support you to develop the data center. So, but nuclear, as I said, it's a topic. Whether we have it or not, time will tell. I brought the same topic up in New Zealand and I got shot down like you wouldn't believe. And I said, well, all your hydro is not going to last you forever. Turn the lights off, I have nuclear. Don't know. Once again, for me, it was a discussion. I think the important thing is around nuclear, having people that actually have knowledge around it, have the discussion. And then as a society, we'll decide whether we have it or not. And it'll be what it is.
And again, from my perspective, coming from the power and grid world, the reason this is topical is because there is a large-scale discussion about renewables to support our future needs. Yes, okay, but particularly in that data center space and how we leverage the fact that there is this revolution happening around the growth in data centers or the growth in AI and data requirements. Compounded with the fact that we are dealing with an energy transition where the grid is trying to move away from fossil fuels towards a more renewables future, trying to manage DER uptake within the distribution network, as well as trying to look at, manage an aging workforce and aging install base. There's a lot happening. And unless we are able, it's a balancing act, right, of looking to satisfy and meet the requirements of all of our stakeholders. And this particular conversation hasn't, in my opinion, hasn't really blown up in the Pacific as much as I hear in the US, but I wonder if that wave is coming for us here as well or not, which is why I think it's topical. And to that point, I guess what one of the things that we're working on is clearly there is, again, if I was to use the US example, there is a strong pipeline of data center development, and grids historically typically like data centers because it's a stable load, it's a certain load, but clearly that dynamic is changing. Clearly there is the need for us to enable a different model of grid connection, and I wonder if you could talk to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you look up here, it talks about 48 gigawatts in the US. I mean, we've got visibility somewhere between, I don't know, anywhere between 2 and 4 gigawatts of visibility of data centers being planned between now and sort of 2030, depending on who you speak to, which piece of literature you look at. Eastern Seaboard, somewhere between 25 and 30 gigawatts. So if you did, let's use 4 gigawatts, make the maths easy, it's more than 10%. So theoretically, in the next 5 years, we're going to add more than 10% of the existing capacity just in data centers, ignoring, electrification, decarbonisation, et cetera, et cetera. So if we look at that and say, well, okay, where's data centers going to play in it? If a data center operator sits there and thinks that it can operate in isolation from the grid, I think you'll start to find the utilities are going to say, well, no, I can't give you that 500 megawatts or that 200. You have to be something more than just a load on the grid. I know that comes to our next topic, but that's the sort of discussion that's happening overseas without question, that the data center is something more than a load. Data centers are actually, as I said, great for driving the economy, but we need people to understand what a data center is and where it can play in the market. And when I say the market, that's the energy consumer market, the energy provider market, depending on which way you look at it.
No, absolutely. So that comes to the point of, can data centers serve as a flexible asset in the grid, right? And one of the things that, it's a very busy slide for those looking at the slide, but I guess just to share, between our two segments, one of the things that Schneider is looking at the moment is building technology so that data centers can become an interactive and a flexible asset to the grid. Effectively, in layman's terms, because I'm no super technical expert, but effectively it's looking at managing data centers as a DER. But what that really means is having that open discussion, and then we're part of consortiums and currently in research and collecting voice of the customer overseas in the US, trying to understand what is a utilities perspective. So again, if I was to speak the grid language, it's to understand what is the DNSP's philosophy in controlling that DER, how far do you want the control to go? But also equally understanding, is there the right appetite from a data center customer to be able to play into a flexibility market? From a grid perspective, what I see is if we can get the technology right, and technology I don't think is going to be the challenge, right? It's enabling the right market and enabling the right discussion to happen so that all stakeholders are on the same page. I think there's a real case here to enable some of the network constraints if data centers can act as a flexible load. I don't think this is being done anywhere globally, unless you will tell me this is happening somewhere, Mark. But I wonder from a CNSP perspective and from dealing with some of these clients every day, do you think there is value that could unlock for the developers as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in a very small aspect that's being done, if you look at things like fast frequency response, that's literally using your UPS capacity that's available to you to take a certain amount of load off to help stabilize the grid. Because as a data center provider, I'd always prefer the grid to be running than not, because it's typically a cheaper form of energy. If you look it up here very simplistically, if you take the left-hand side where we're looking at a data center that, let's say it was 80 megawatts, what this is talking about in some ways is say, well, okay, do we add an extra 20 megawatts? And that 20 megawatts potentially is 20 megawatts of energy storage. So all of a sudden now I've got 20 megawatts of energy storage to play with the grid. So no longer am I just an 80 megawatt load. I'm an 80 megawatt load plus 20 megawatts of available energy storage to play with the grid. Now, I can be very selfish and use that 20 megawatts for, peak demand and play on the energy markets and do all those things. Great. The other interesting thing is, if you look at data centers, they have lots and lots of diesel generators sitting there. Now, diesel generators, lots of capex, lots of diesel fuel, etc. Now, not to say that you want to necessarily use your diesel generators, but once again, interacting with the grid. I spoke before about energy generation. So let's take those diesel generators, move them to gas turbines, and actually use those gas turbines to be part of the grid. So all of a sudden, the data center is no longer a load. It's an energy storage facility. It's a generation facility. It helps stabilizing the grid. It's helped keeping the grid up. Now, when I start to talk to a utility as a data center provider, hang on a minute, I'm no longer just a load on your network. I'm someone that can actually work with you to keep the grid up. The other really important thing is if I take that 20 megawatts, typically no 500 megawatt data center is 500 megawatts day one. So if I go and deploy my capital, my energy storage, it allows me a nice way to potentially get a return on my investment earlier. As my load increases from 100 to 200, etc., that 20 megawatts of BESS, for example, is there being utilized, all those generators. So certainly we're discussing it in the US. There is a group formed around discussing it, because what we're finding is the industry is actually coming to Schneider Electric and saying, hey guys, Schneider, how can you help us? And when we're talking about help here, it's around the controls, the interaction with the grid, and the different energy sources to help data center providers and the network providers. This is not the data center guys just coming to Schneider saying, how can you help us? This is actually the network or the utilities in the US coming to us and saying, guys, how can we work together to actually provide a better solution? So if I look at Australia and say, is it applicable here? Absolutely it is. If I look at the amount of wind, solar, etc. in the network, one of our biggest limitations at the moment for renewables is energy storage. Colette spoke about 16 gigawatts. She needed 16 gigawatt hours. She just said 16 gigawatts, but 16 gigawatt hours. If you think of that, I said something like 30 gigawatts of capacity. So that's 24 by 7. So 16 gigawatt hours, it's nothing. It's like that. So even though 16 gigawatt hours sounds like a lot, in the scheme of things, it's not a lot. So how can we take that significant capacity that's going to be built into data centers and turn it into something that supports that energy storage or that energy generation? So for me, I think this is a great discussion to be had, and how we as an industry can work together to achieve a better outcome for all of us, whether that's a generator, storage, etc.
No, I couldn't agree with you more. I think in particularly in Australia, the energy transition has been so heavily led by rooftop solar, and then with the strong ambitions that we have to move towards net zero, etc., and the focus on getting ourselves to 83% renewable generation in 5 years' time, there's a lot of work happening within the energy transition. And I wonder, is potentially the reason that we've not seen this level of conversation in Australia. But I think it's coming. I think there is definitely a discussion for us to have on how we can enable more flexible grid connections for data centers. Definitely a conversation that we're starting to see happen a lot more in Sydney and Melbourne, and perhaps it's coming to other ports like Adelaide and Perth, etc. Also. So to that point, I know I'm being told that I'm at time, but I would like to open the floor for a couple of questions, and also just to let the audience know that this is, we haven't got the answers yet. The industry, as well as ourselves, we're engaged in discussions to see how we can make this a reality. And we would love to be able to collect voice of the customer being, data centers as well as utilities, have a workshop, have those engaged conversations to get to a solution, really. Thank you again.